Welcome to another video from CloudLearnX. In this video, I'll be talking about the usage of calculators starting at a young age. I've chosen this topic especially because I've heard a lot of parents and even some tutors have this perception that introducing calculators at a young age will dumb down the brains of their kids and even have various other negative impacts on their math education. I want to shed some light as to whether this is true and also explore some of the positive aspects of introducing calculators. And I'll also share the experience we've had at CloudLearnX teaching students and how we've overcome some of the problems we've had with calculator usage and how we incorporate calculators to deliver a better learning experience for students. All right, so to start off, calculators isn't the problem, right? Calculators are an essential tool when learning math. So here are a few reasons why. Number one is that most international curriculums, I'll specifically talk about it, Excel allows the use of calculators in their exams. So this wasn't the case a few years back where the exam style was one paper was non-calculator while the other was calculator. Now all exams allow the use of calculator. So if your kid is does not have fluency with a calculator, then they're going to be at a disadvantage in the exam. So we don't want that. Number two is the whole idea behind introducing a calculator is that it's going to save time in simplification, mental math, and carrying out extensive calculations by hand, and rather focusing that time on developing deeper understanding of the concepts and introducing newer concepts into the curriculum. So a lot of parents have this argument that once you introduce calculators into a curriculum, the standard drops. But this is far from the truth. Once you introduce calculators, the standards increase and students are expected to have more critical thinking capacity to solve the problems. So yeah, that's another reason we should have calculators. Number three is that the whole objective of learning math is to be able to apply this in real life problems. So curriculums introduce calculators because they believe that replicating a similar environment to real life is the best way for them to adapt to real life problem solving. And therefore, they give them access to the tools they would have in real life, like a calculator. So, yeah, these are the reasons why calculators aren't the problem. It's an essential tool uh, when learning math. But let's also look at some of the benefits of incorporating calculators in lessons that we've seen at CloudLearnX when we teach sessions. Number one is that it empowers students to verify concepts. For example, when I teach square roots, I would tell my students that the square roots of negative numbers is is not real and does not make any sense. And so instead of students just writing it down or memorizing that concept, they can take their calculator that's around them and then test for themselves. They can do square root of -3, square root of -25, and test for themselves and verify that, which is a great way to reinforce a concept rather than a one-way delivery where the tutor teaches everything and the students memorize. So calculator um, facilitates that. So that's something good. Number two is exploration. A student without a calculator is limited by his or her mental math capacity or simplification ability, right? But once you have a calculator, you have all the mathematical operation, all the tools in that tool. So there's no limitations for what you can try, and there's no penalty for getting something wrong or trying something different, which I think is great, which we've seen in CloudLearnX, that students come up with new questions, different we have different discussions during our lessons. That's productive for learning math. that they've figured out using their calculators. Um, yeah, so apart from that, the third point is that, which I think is really powerful, is want to use a calculator effectively. From a young age, students have to practice the mathematical syntax and the rule set when entering mathematical calculations into a calculator. They need to know how to use parentheses, how to separate different components in a complicated equation, and how to understand the order of operations and how that can give different answers. And once they get used to that, I've seen that they've transferred that onto paper as well. And that happens naturally without having to memorize all these syntaxes and rules like bit mass and things like that, which I think is a huge plus. And number four is the ability to receive immediate feedback. So some of the students you may see in classroom settings or even one-to-one sessions, some students are afraid to express their ideas and opinions um, regarding something that they've thought about or uh, some answer they've come up with. So a calculator helps bridge that gap a little bit. So a student has the ability to, if they have something in their mind, they can test it using a calculator. And if they feel it's reasonable or sensible, then they can propose it to the tutor or the teacher and get some feedback. So rather than hiding that idea and keeping it to themselves, they have a tool that gives them some feedback. So that's definitely useful for a student that we've seen in our lessons. Okay, so these are some benefits. Of course, here's the major problem with calculators. Um, it's bypassing critical thinking. And I'll tell you why, what that is. Here's the deal. So if you have a math problem, either a tutor gives a math problem to the student or it's on a question paper, the general process is that first we expect the student to think about it. Think about what the question is asking us. Think about what concepts are useful and what steps might be involved, right? That's the critical thinking part. And then finally, once you've got down the steps in your mind, then you go to your calculation, where that's where the calculator should come into play. Now, there's several instances where this might be different, but overall, this is what we expect. But what happens when students rely too much on a calculator is that they completely skip the critical thinking part and then they go to their calculator. Whenever they see a question, they have this urge to plug numbers into the calculator and get answers and see, validate things. They look for keywords and they plug it in the calculator. They look for numbers, do different calculations, and come up with the answers. Now, this actually works during primary levels and year 6, year 7. And that's why some parents would say that our student scores really well, 90 plus at a young age. But then once critical thinking becomes important at higher levels, then they get exposed and then their marks start dropping. And this could is one of the major reasons as to why that happens. So let's take an example. Here's an example of what might happen. So this concept of squaring numbers, pretty simple. 3 squared equals 9, minus 5 squared equals 25. Once you have a calculator, you don't really need to understand what is going on. Right? You have this button, you can take any number, square it, right? So, but the underlying principle or the fundamental behind squaring is that you are multiplying a number by itself. So sometimes students may not know this, or over time, because they're using their calculator to solve this, they forget this, right? And this is not really a problem. This is unexposed, right? No one really finds this out until you get a question like this. So here's a question I've given a student, and I ask the student, could you help me find a value of x that would make this denominator 0, right? And then 95% of the students will somehow figure 2 out, x equals 2, right? Some of them would also use a calculator. They'll do 1 squared minus 4 and then try 2 squared, and then they'll get 2. That's about 95% or more students will get 2. But then they completely forget, or they do not even understand that minus 2 is an option as well. They only start understanding it once I explain to them what squaring is, and when I tell them that it's multiplying a number by itself. Some students can think, okay, negative numbers come into play, and then they might get minus 2 as well. But I may have to even extend and go on to say, what might happen if we multiply two negative numbers, right? And then they start to realize that minus 2 is also an option. But until this stage, until this problem, this gap, this knowledge of this concept is unexposed. It's like you have a really uh, fungus spread wall, and you have all termites uh, destroying all the wall, but you put a layer of paint on top of it. That's your calculator. It hides it and it works for some time, but then once you get a problem that tests your conceptual understanding, it breaks down, right? So we want to avoid this as tutors, and I'll give some practices that we use to avoid this sort of thing. All right, so here's another problem with calculators. It challenges in vocabulary and presentation of solution. So here's one of the problems I gave a student, and this is how he he presented the answer. The answer is perfectly correct, and he has also given me a calculation that he did. Now, what so they might get full marks for this, but what I really expect is this, right? You can see that the answer is correct, and these two steps are available, but the first two steps are missing. I believe that the first two steps is the critical thinking part, is being able to get the vocabulary to present a solution in a way that can be understood by anyone, right? This is the part. Sometimes out of practice or memory, a student can get this answer. And some tutors would just correct it and move on, right? But the underlying principle, underlying fundamental, the student may not know, right? So if they can't present it in this way, if they can't put it into words, if they can't bring math into their language, that's a problem. And we see that problem aggravate with the use of calculators. When people rely on calculators, they just focus on the answer and maybe this step, mathematical procedure, but they forget about how to present an answer, how to break down, how to incorporate it into the language. So those are areas that needs to be that are problematic when you rely too much on calculators, right? So teachers and tutors need to adapt. We need to change how we teach. We need to bring new things into the table if we want to prevent such problems. At CloudLearnX, we follow some teaching practices that you too, if you're a teacher, can try things out. So asking thought-provoking questions, open-ended questions. So questions that require explanations more than just a calculation. Um, Getting students to explain, getting students to tell me what the problem is asking us, right? Getting students to tell me how they plan on solving this question, right? Those sort of questions will get the student thinking, right? And they'll have to have a conceptual understanding to tell me, explain, and put it into words. So that's one. Number two is encouraging explanations and thinking aloud. Now, one of the things when students start off sessions with us, you'll often see that when I ask students to think out loud, they'll be silent until they start plugging on the calculator. They'll tell me what they're plugging in their calculator, right? Because they don't think. They just plug it in the calculator, and when I ask them to think out loud, they don't have anything to say. So it's important that it happens. It doesn't happen overnight. Students require some training, and then they start thinking before they go into their calculator, because having some tool in your hand, there's this urge to go for it. But with training, you can get them to always think first and then move on to your calculator finally. Authentic assessment, I'll also be doing a video on this soon and publishing it. Authentic assessment, I think, is one of the great best ways to um, best practices to prevent problems or overcome problems that we see with bypassing critical thinking. Because authentic assessments, unlike normal exam questions uh, and other questions, practice questions, the focus is not mainly on the final answer, but on the process and the thinking part. There's more focus on that. So that definitely puts students into test and really gives tutors a really good assessment or feedback as to whether the student has really understood the concepts. So that's great. Number 4 is do not restrict or make calculators a banned item or restricted item in sessions. Right? I would never say in CloudLearnX to not use calculators or do not use it. I would try and get the student to use the calculator when teaching concepts if it's useful. Just like I mentioned with the square roots example, there's many aspects where we can incorporate calculators into our session. So don't make it a banned item, make it part of your sessions, right? So okay, here's an example of authentic assessment. If you look at this question, I want you to focus on this keyword. Part A, explain how you think. Explain why Julie thinks. This question is out of a textbook and completely focuses on uh, the conceptual understanding. It involves no calculations, but I would say this is more challenging to students than having to calculate things, because it pushes them beyond the limits of a calculator, and they have to construct an answer. You can see over here the student had to construct an answer, explain, and they have to use vocabulary, right? They have to use proper mathematical terms and ideas and present it in a meaningful manner. And that's really what authentic assessment is about. That's one example. So here you can see that the tutor has got the student to describe what the event is, what the outcomes are. So there are different questions and activities that that tutors must focus on rather than the final answer, right? That's where that's how we can overcome the issues of relying too much on calculators while incorporating calculators into our sessions. All right, so that's about it. If you think you want personalized tutoring, you can join CloudLearnX. You can reach out to us on our FB page, CloudLearnX, or even reach out to us on WhatsApp to book a demo session and to excel in math. All right then, until the next video, have a nice day.